My name is Robert Hayes. I'm saying that once because that's how these things are supposed to begin. Identification, a record, proof that a person existed behind the voice. After this, it doesn't matter anymore. The station is empty. It has been for 3 days. I didn't notice at first. That's not a joke. There were no slammed doors, no dramatic exits. People just stopped coming in. Desks stayed cluttered. Coffee cups dried where they were left. The newsroom clock kept ticking like it always had. Loud enough to be annoying, quiet enough to ignore. I stayed because the transmitter light was still on. I stayed because the emergency automation system kept looping the same preloaded advisories every hour. Generic language. Remain calm. Await further instruction. Messages written by people who assumed someone would still be there to instruct. I stayed because leaving felt premature. Outside, the city looked normal in the way a photograph looks normal. Everything present. Nothing moving quite right. Traffic lights still cycled, but fewer cars responded to them. Buses ran half empty. A police cruiser sat at the same intersection all day without pulling anyone over. At first, there was no panic. That's important to say. People imagine panic as the beginning of collapse. It isn't. Panic comes later when options vanish. What came first was hesitation. On the second morning, I received a call from a water treatment technician. He didn't give his name. He asked if we were still live. I told him yes. He said the numbers were wrong. Not alarming numbers. Not catastrophic ones. Just readings that didn't match historical patterns. Chemical balances drifting without explanation. He said they recalibrated the sensors twice. Same result. I asked him what it meant. He said he didn't know. He said management told them to log it and continue operations. He said someone from the regional office took the data drives and left without answering questions. I thanked him for calling. I told him we'd report it responsibly. I didn't report it at all. That wasn't cowardice. It was uncertainty. Broadcasting speculation is how you lose credibility, and credibility felt like the only currency still holding value. I told myself I would wait for confirmation. By afternoon, the emergency loop stopped updating. It didn't go silent. It just froze. The same advisory played every hour, timestamp unchanged. A system designed to reassure now felt abandoned mid-sentence. Government briefings continued online, but they were careful in the way that makes your skin tighten. No direct answers. No technical language. Lots of reassurance that monitoring is ongoing. Phones still worked then. People called about taste changes in tap water. Metallic. Bitter. Some said it smelled like a swimming pool. Others said it smelled like nothing at all. I told them to use bottled water if they had it. That night, I slept in the studio chair because going home felt like breaking a vigil I didn't consciously agree to keep. On day 3, grocery stores shortened their hours. Not announced, just closed early. Shelves still looked full enough if you didn't look closely. No bottled water restocks. No fresh produced delivery. The bread aisle thinned quietly. Cash registers still accepted bills, but clerks hesitated before taking them, like they were being handed something fragile. The city issued its first official statement regarding the water late that evening. It was 3 paragraphs long and said nothing measurable. Out of an abundance of caution. No immediate risk. Infrastructure adjustments underway. They did not say do not drink. They did not say safe. That absence did more damage than a warning ever could. I kept broadcasting. Not advice. Just observation. Times. Behaviors. What I could verify with my own eyes. People began listening again. Not because I had answers, but because I wasn't pretending to. Someone left a handwritten note taped to the station door. It asked if the broadcasts were real or automated. I left the note there. I didn't write back. On the 4th day, a man collapsed outside a pharmacy 2 blocks away. I saw it through the studio window. He didn't convulse. He just sat down hard and didn't get back up. People watched from a distance. No one touched him. An ambulance arrived 40 minutes later. 2 paramedics. No urgency. They loaded him carefully and drove away without lights. That night, the water pressure dropped. Not gone, just inconsistent. Faucets coughed before running. Toilets refilled slowly. Small mechanical signs that something upstream was being rationed. I aired that fact. I said exactly that. Water pressure is inconsistent across several blocks. Within minutes, the phone lines filled. People didn't ask what was happening. They asked how long they had. That was when I realized the danger wasn't contamination alone. It was time. By the 5th day, the city stopped pretending the schedule mattered. Office towers still opened, but fewer lights came on. Schools announced temporary closures without end dates. Municipal workers showed up late, left early, or didn't show up at all. No one explained where they went. No one asked. I kept a notebook beside the console. Not for feelings, for timestamps. When systems failed, when statements were released, when they contradicted each other. Patterns only exist if someone bothers to record them. That morning, the Water Authority issued a clarification. Not a warning, a clarification. They advised residents to consider alternative hydration sources if they experienced sensory irregularities. Sensory, as if taste were a rumor. I read the statement verbatim on air. No commentary, just the words as written. Then I waited. The first caller was a nurse from a private clinic on the east side. She said patients were coming in dehydrated but afraid to drink. She said bottled water was gone by noon the day before. She said suppliers canceled deliveries without explanation. I asked her if she had seen illness consistent with contamination. She paused, long enough that I thought the call dropped. Then she said, "I've seen things that don't have a name yet." After that, calls came faster. A delivery driver said his route was cut in half because the distribution center shut down for maintenance. A warehouse supervisor said inventory data had been wiped overnight and no one could log back in. A grocer said suppliers demanded payment in advance, in cash, before even discussing restock. Cash. The word started appearing everywhere. Banks were still open then, but the lines were longer and quieter. ATMs worked intermittently. When they didn't, people hit the buttons harder, like pressure could summon money. I walked outside at noon to see it myself. The air felt unchanged. No ash, no smell. That was part of the problem. Disasters that announce themselves are easier to believe. At a corner store, two men argued softly over the last case of bottled water. No shouting, no threats, just repetition, each insisting the other didn't need it as badly. The clerk stood behind the counter pretending to rearrange nothing. I didn't intervene, not because I didn't care, because I had nothing to offer them that would matter. By evening, the arguments grew shorter. People stopped debating. They took what they could reach first. I returned to the station to find the emergency automation had stopped entirely. No loop, no fallback, just silence between my broadcasts. When I checked the back-end system, the server connection returned an error code I'd never seen before. Not offline, not unauthorized, just unavailable. I filled the silence myself. I told listeners what I had seen. Stores rationing without signage. Pharmacies locking certain aisles. Gas stations closing pumps while keeping lights on. I reminded them not to trust rumors but to trust patterns. That phrase followed me longer than I expected. On day 6, the first official boil advisory was issued. Not citywide, just select zones. No map provided. No list. Just a suggestion to boil water where feasible. Feasible became another dangerous word. Electricity still held, but it flickered in ways that felt deliberate. Rolling reductions, not outages. Enough power to keep systems alive. Not enough to support strain. Elevators stalled between floors. Traffic signals reset mid-cycle. Hospitals requested conservation. Not of water, of time. Non-emergency procedures canceled. Patients sent home with instructions to monitor symptoms themselves. I read that memo too, word for word. That night, someone broke into the station lobby. Not violently, no shattered glass. They forced the side door with something thin and patient. I heard them moving through the dark, opening drawers, closing them again, searching. I didn't confront them. I stayed in the booth, door locked, microphone live. After a while, they left. In the morning, I found the vending machine empty and the first aid kit gone. They didn't touch the broadcast equipment. That felt intentional, as if the voice mattered more than the supplies. By the end of the week, grocery stores stopped pretending to restock. Shelves stayed bare long enough to remove doubt. Price tags remained useless and optimistic. Barter began quietly. A woman traded batteries for canned soup in a parking lot. A mechanic accepted antibiotics instead of cash for a brake job. A landlord accepted bottled water as partial rent. I didn't judge it on air. I just described it. Conflicts followed. Not riots. Small, ugly disagreements that ended relationships instead of lives. Someone accused a neighbor of hoarding. Someone else accused a clerk of hiding inventory. Trust thinned faster than supplies. The city held a press conference on the 8th day. No questions allowed. The official spoke about temporary disruptions and external variables. He promised stabilization. Behind him, the sign language interpreter paused twice, then stopped interpreting entirely. That detail bothered me more than the speech. Later that night, the phones went dead for an hour. Not disconnected, just silent. When they came back, several voicemail messages were missing. Not unheard. Missing. I made a note. On day 9, a man showed up at the station door with a handwritten list of names. He said they were people who hadn't come home. Not missing persons reports. Just names he remembered. He asked me to read them on air. I didn't. I told him I couldn't verify them. That I needed confirmation. That broadcasting names could cause panic. He stared at me like I'd spoken another language. Then he folded the paper carefully and left without another word. That night, I dreamed of running water. When I woke up, the faucets were dry. The phones didn't die all at once. They became unreliable first, which was worse. Calls dropped mid-sentence. Texts arrived hours late, stripped of context. Voicemail timestamps stopped matching reality. You could no longer trust sequence, only presence. I warned listeners not to assume silence meant safety. Internet access degraded unevenly. Some sites loaded as if nothing was wrong. Others returned cached versions from days earlier. Official pages updated headlines without updating content, like mannequins rearranged in a dark store. Social media filled the gaps with certainty. Charts without sources. Maps without legends. Claims that contradicted themselves within the same paragraph. People shared them anyway, not because they believed them, but because sharing felt like action. On the 12th day, the city's emergency website redirected to a national portal that required authentication no civilian had. It wasn't an error page. It was a closed door. I read the redirect address on air. Someone later told me it stopped working an hour after that. That afternoon, the last newspaper in the city suspended print. Not permanently, indefinitely. The editor's note said distribution logistics were temporarily incompatible with current conditions. The phrase lingered with me, as if reality itself no longer supported delivery. People began disappearing in the administrative sense first. Utility accounts flagged inactive. Payroll systems froze. School enrollment databases stopped responding. If you didn't exist in a system, services no longer reached you. I received an email from a city IT contractor who said entire directories had been archived overnight. Not deleted, archived, like evidence boxed and shelved. He asked me if that meant something. I told him I didn't know. On day 14, the military convoys arrived. Not with sirens. Not with announcements. They rolled through arterial roads at dawn. Engine steady, windows opaque. No insignia I recognized. No stops. They didn't distribute supplies. They didn't set up checkpoints. They left the city by noon. I described what I saw. Vehicle counts. Directions. Times. Listeners called in to say the same convoys passed through their neighborhoods without slowing. Some waved. No one waved back. By evening, a government spokesperson appeared on what remained of the public broadcast channel. He spoke for less than 4 minutes. He said troop movements were precautionary redeployments. He said there was no cause for concern. He did not say where they went. The next morning, several federal buildings were closed. No notices, just locked doors and posted signs that read, "Operations relocated." No address given. People gathered outside anyway, holding paperwork that no longer meant anything. Permit applications, medical referrals, immigration documents, proof that they once belonged to something larger. No one came out to meet them. I continued broadcasting even as my audience thinned. Some told me they listened on battery radios now. Others said they recorded the transmissions because live reception was unpredictable. That unsettled me. A recorded voice implies an ending. On day 16, the city council held its last meeting. I know because the public calendar updated once, then froze. A clerk leaked the agenda to a local forum. It contained only one item: continuity determination. No minutes were ever released. That night, a woman called asking if evacuation was planned. She said buses were rumored to be coming. She asked where to wait. I told her I had no confirmation. She thanked me anyway, which felt undeserved. The following day, fuel rationing began without announcement. Gas stations closed entirely or limited purchases to amounts that couldn't get you out of the city. Payment systems rejected cards, then rejected cash. One station accepted silver jewelry. I watched a man trade his wedding ring for 10 liters of fuel. He didn't look at his hand afterward. On day 18, the regional governor's office released a statement confirming temporary administrative withdrawal from several urban centers. The word withdrawal was buried halfway through the text, surrounded by reassurances. I read it slowly. People called in angry, confused, relieved. Some said withdrawal meant relief forces were coming. Others said it meant abandonment. No one could prove either. That afternoon, municipal workers stopped collecting trash. Bags piled up at curbs, then split open. Animals returned to streets they'd avoided for decades. Not rats at first, dogs. Packs of them moving cautiously, learning. The smell arrived later. I stayed in the station because it still had power, because the transmitter still worked, because leaving would mean choosing a direction, and all directions felt dishonest. On day 20, I received a call from a man who claimed to be part of a state logistics unit. He spoke carefully, like every word had been approved by someone else. He said cities were being deprioritized. I asked him what that meant. He said resources were finite and decisions had been made. I asked him who made them. The line went dead. That night, the city skyline went dark in sections. Not blackouts, strategic shutdowns. Neighborhood by neighborhood, lights went out and did not return. The remaining illuminated areas felt exposed, like islands drawing attention. I advised listeners to conserve batteries, to avoid unnecessary travel, to trust no single source of information, including me. I said that last part out loud and it surprised me. On day 21, the national broadcast frequency went silent. No farewell, no explanation. The first person who begged me for help did not sound desperate. That's what stayed with me. His voice was steady, practiced, like someone used to explaining problems over the phone. He said his name, gave his location, and described the situation in bullet points, as if clarity would earn assistance. He said his wife was sick, not violently, not visibly dying, just wrong. She couldn't keep water down. Her skin felt hot and dry at the same time. He said the clinic had closed without notice. He said the hospital turned them away and handed him a pamphlet printed 3 days earlier. He asked if I knew where to get clean water. I did know. I had a small reserve in the station. Enough for a few days if I rationed carefully. Enough to share, once. I told him I was a broadcaster, not a coordinator. I told him I had no verified distribution points. I told him I was sorry. He didn't argue. He thanked me for my honesty and ended the call. I stared at the microphone for a long time after that, aware that I had chosen to remain useful instead of being kind. I justified it by telling myself that leaving the station would silence the broadcast, that the broadcast mattered to more people than one woman. That logic did not comfort me. The next morning, the water did not return. Pumps failed in sequence rather than all at once. Pressure spikes followed by long droughts. Some neighborhoods reported brown runoff when faucets briefly worked. Others reported nothing at all. Toilets stopped refilling. Fire suppression systems flagged offline. The city issued a statement advising residents to limit consumption. No alternatives offered. No timeline. Electricity became unpredictable. Not outages. Interruptions. Power would cut for minutes, then return weaker. Equipment rebooted endlessly. Refrigeration failed quietly, spoiling food without ceremony. I adjusted my broadcast schedule to conserve the station's backup power. Shorter segments. Longer silences. I hated the silences, but pretending continuity would have been dishonest. People began leaving messages instead of calling. Handwritten notes slipped under the station door. Requests, warnings, accusations. One simply said, "Why are you still talking?" On day 24, the sewage system failed. It was not announced. It was discovered. Streets flooded where they never had before. Basements filled with things that did not belong there. The smell became constant, impossible to ignore, settling into fabric and lungs. Hospitals shut down entirely after backup generators failed. Some patients were transferred. Others were discharged with instructions written by staff who knew they would not be there tomorrow. I read those instructions on air, not to instruct, but to record them. Rest. Hydrate if possible. Seek assistance if symptoms worsen. Seek where. That afternoon, I found the man who had called about his wife's name on a handwritten list taped to a traffic light. No context. Just names, one per line. Some crossed out. I did not know what the crossing out meant. Power stabilized briefly on day 26, just long enough for officials to issue reassurances. They said systems were cycling. They said service would be restored in phases. The phases never came. Instead, the grid locked into a permanent state of partial failure. Lights dim. Machines unreliable. Elevators dead. Radios crackling with reduced range. Civilization operating at half-breath. Water advisories shifted language again. Do not consume. Do not bathe. Avoid contact. People who had ignored earlier warnings grew sick. People who had followed them grew weak. There was no correct behavior anymore, only consequences delayed differently. I considered leaving the station that night, packing what I could and heading somewhere undefined. The idea lasted until I tried to imagine turning off the transmitter myself. Couldn't. On day 28, the emergency services number stopped connecting. Not busy, not rerouted, just unreachable. The kind of silence that tells you the other end no longer exists. I announced that fact. I should not have. Panic followed immediately. People realized the last safety net had dissolved without ceremony. There would be no escalation beyond themselves. That night, someone pounded on the station door for an hour. I did not answer. I told myself they wanted supplies, or shelter, or the microphone. I told myself opening the door would not fix anything. When the pounding stopped, the guilt did not. The next morning, the power went out permanently. The backup generator kicked in, louder than I remembered. Fuel reserves dropped visibly each hour. I recalculated again and again, stretching numbers thinner than they wanted to go. I announced a reduced broadcast schedule. I told listeners I would continue as long as possible. Someone wrote "coward" on the station wall in red paint. Someone else crossed it out. That night, I dreamed of water again. Not running, just sitting still in a glass, untouched. When I woke up, my mouth was dry enough to hurt. Hope arrived the way lies usually do. Cleanly phrased, officially timed. Delivered just before people were ready to abandon restraint. The announcement came through a restored government frequency that none of us knew still existed. A narrowband transmission, strong enough to cut through the noise, weak enough to feel temporary. It repeated every 30 minutes, identical each time. Evacuation assistance will be provided at designated civic centers. Bring identification. Bring only essential belongings. Transportation capacity is limited. No locations were named in the first cycle. That didn't stop people. They moved anyway. I left the station briefly to see it with my own eyes. Streams of people walking in the same direction without speaking, guided by assumption more than instruction. Families pushing carts. Elderly couples leaning into each other for balance. Children carrying backpacks that looked heavier than they were. At the nearest civic center, a line had already formed by the time I arrived. It wrapped around the building twice, then folded in on itself. People waited quietly at first, like good behavior might earn priority. No staff appeared. After 2 hours, a single bus arrived. It was not marked. No logos. No escort. Just a vehicle with tinted windows and a driver who never made eye contact. It took exactly 47 people. The doors closed without explanation. The rest of the line did not move. I returned to the station and reported what I saw. I emphasized what I did not see. No coordination. No supplies. No medical presence. Just motion without structure. The announcement continued anyway. By nightfall, every civic space was surrounded. Not guarded. Occupied. People slept on concrete, clutching paperwork that no one had asked to see. Fights broke out over position. Someone claimed a clipboard meant authority. Someone else challenged it. A woman was trampled near the entrance. Not crushed, just knocked down and not helped up quickly enough. By the time space cleared around her, she was no longer breathing. The bus did not return. The next morning, a second announcement modified the language. Due to high demand, evacuation operations will be staggered. Staggered implied sequence. None came. That was when illness accelerated. People had been sick before. Quietly, individually. Now it moved through crowds like a second language. Vomiting, fever, disorientation, a rash that didn't match any pamphlet description, dehydration that progressed faster than expected. I received a call from a retired physician who said the symptoms suggested multiple exposures layered over each other. Not one contaminant, not one failure, a system poisoned in stages. He said treatment would have been possible early. He did not say it was now. Bodies began appearing indoors first. People who laid down to rest and didn't get up. Neighbors noticed by smell before sound. Doors stayed closed because opening them meant acknowledging responsibility. I stopped describing symptoms on air after the third day. Not because they weren't real, but because repetition turned them into background noise. People listened longer when I spoke about absences instead. Hospitals that had reopened briefly during the evacuation announcement closed again, this time with signs taped inside the glass. No capacity, no intake, no exceptions. Ambulances sat idle with no fuel. On day 32, the buses stopped coming altogether. The announcement did not. People waited anyway. Some refused to leave, convinced the next cycle would be different. Others tried to force their way inside empty buildings, believing shelter mattered more than transport. Shots were fired near the downtown center that afternoon. Not many, not wildly, enough to end arguments quickly. I did not describe the gunfire. I described the way the crowd reorganized afterward. Smaller groups, more distance, fewer children visible. Disease followed retreat. People who fled the centers carried sickness with them into neighborhoods that had avoided the worst of it. Families that had rationed carefully now shared air with returning relatives who brought more than stories. I received fewer calls. Not because things were improving, because fewer people had the strength to talk. On day 35, I attempted to catalog the dead. I stopped at 47, not because that was the total, because it was the number of names I could confirm without guessing. Writing more would have meant inventing certainty. I slept less, drank less, thought about water more than anything else. The generator coughed that night and didn't stop coughing. Fuel reserves were nearly gone. I recalculated again, subtracting minutes from a future that refused to stay fixed. I made an announcement that I might not be able to continue daily. No one argued. Control did not arrive wearing uniforms. It arrived wearing familiarity. Neighborhood groups formed first around practical needs. Shared cooking fires, rotating watches, lists of who had what and who needed it most. The language was cooperative, almost gentle. People said "we" a lot. I reported that too. Within days, the lists became permissions. The watches became checkpoints. The shared supplies became leverage. A group calling itself a council set up 2 blocks from the station. They hung a hand-painted sign at the intersection and said the area was now protected. They asked residents to register. Names, skills, inventory. Participation was optional in the way gravity is optional. They sent someone to speak with me. A man in his early 40s, clean-shaven, calm. He said they appreciated the broadcast. He said information was stability. He said they wanted to make sure I was aligned. I asked him what alignment meant. He smiled and said it meant accuracy. After that, some callers stopped getting through. Not because the lines were down, because they were being watched when they tried. I learned this when a woman whispered into the phone that she couldn't talk long and asked me not to repeat her name. I repeated nothing. I described trends instead. Patterns without identifiers. That kept me tolerated. Other neighborhoods went further. Barricades, armbands, curfews enforced by people who used to argue about parking. Outsiders were turned away, sometimes violently, sometimes with apologies that didn't change outcomes. Protection turned into ownership. I received a call from a man who said his brother was being held by a local group for violating water rules. He asked me to announce it to shame them into release. I didn't. I told myself that broadcasting accusations without verification could make things worse. I told myself silence was neutrality. Silence chose a side anyway. By day 40, the city had fractured into pockets. No central authority. No shared rules. Each block negotiating reality independently. Some places were quiet and careful. Others loud and cruel. Travel became dangerous not because of chaos, but because of order. Too many rules layered on top of each other, conflicting and enforced without appeal. That was when people began trying to leave. Not all at once. In waves. Families pooling fuel. Groups scavenging vehicles that still ran. Rumors spread about highways still open, about towns untouched, about water that didn't burn your throat. I reported the rumors as rumors. The first wave never made it past the outer ring. I know because they called me from traffic that didn't move. Cars stalled bumper to bumper, engines overheating, fuel gauges sinking. No law enforcement, no assistance, just heat and time. Some abandoned their vehicles and tried to walk. Others stayed, convinced motion would resume if they waited long enough. Didn't. On the 3rd day, scavengers arrived. They did not look like monsters. They looked efficient. They took fuel first, then batteries, then anything that could be traded later. They left people alive if it cost nothing. Highways became traps. The second wave learned from the first. They tried side roads, back routes, paths that didn't appear on maps anymore. Some made it farther. None called back. I described the silence that followed instead. Inside the city, local groups tightened control. Exit taxes were imposed. Travel permits issued by people with no authority beyond presence. Some neighborhoods banned departure entirely, arguing that population loss weakened defense. I received a call from a teenage boy who said his family was being prevented from leaving because his father was useful. I asked him where he was calling from. He said he didn't know. He had been moved. I ended the call quickly, afraid listening longer would make me complicit. On day 44, the council near the station announced new water distribution rules. I was to receive a daily ration if I agreed to broadcast their updates verbatim. I asked if I had a choice. They said choice was inefficient. I did not agree. They did not cut me off. They simply reduced the water delivery. Enough to survive, not enough to share. That night, I dreamed of roads stretching clean and empty, leading somewhere that did not require permission. When I woke up, the generator sputtered again. Fuel was nearly gone. I recalculated and realized the broadcast would end soon, whether I wanted it to or not. I told listeners that escape was not a plan. That movement without certainty was just relocation of risk. I told them staying was dangerous too. I told them there were no good options left. Some thanked me, some cursed me, most said nothing. The collapse did not announce itself. There was no final message, no last warning, no moment that felt official enough to mark the end. Systems don't fail ceremonially. They just stop responding one layer at a time until there is nothing left to appeal to. The broadcast frequency went quiet 3 days after the council reduced my water ration. Not faded, not interrupted, gone. I noticed because my monitor showed transmission output, but no return signal. The equipment said I was speaking. The city said nothing back. I kept talking anyway for 2 hours. Habit is a powerful thing. When I finally stopped, the silence felt heavier than anything I'd described before. Not dramatic silence, administrative silence. The kind that means no one is listening because no one is tasked with listening anymore. Emergency broadcasts never returned. Not nationally, not locally. Whatever infrastructure supported them had been dismantled or abandoned. I couldn't tell which was worse. The generator failed the next morning. No sputter this time. No warning. Just absence. The lights cut. The equipment died mid-standby. The station, which had felt like a shelter for weeks, became just another empty building filled with obsolete tools. I sat in the dark for a long time, holding the microphone even though it was no longer connected to anything. Then I put it down. Outside, the city had changed texture. Not visibly at first glance. Buildings still stood. Roads still existed. But the rhythm was gone. No schedules. No expectations. Movement happened only when necessary, and even then cautiously. Neighborhood councils no longer pretended to coordinate. They enforced boundaries and called it survival. Signs appeared warning outsiders away. Some polite, some not. I packed what I could carry. Not much. A backpack. A notebook. 2 bottles of water I didn't want to think about the origin of. I locked the station door behind me, not because it mattered, but because locking things used to mean something. I did not look back. Walking felt wrong at first, like abandoning a post I had never officially been assigned. Every step away from the station felt like a small betrayal of the voice I'd been. But staying would have meant waiting for someone else to decide my usefulness. I chose uncertainty instead. The streets were quieter than I expected. Not empty, just restrained. People watched from windows without signaling. Doors opened and closed quickly. Conversations happened behind barriers now. I passed a school where the playground had been dismantled for materials. The swings were gone. The metal frame cut apart and stacked neatly. Someone had painted numbers on the pieces for inventory. Children adapt faster than adults. That scared me more than their absence. Further out, the city thinned into industrial corridors. Warehouses stood open, already stripped of anything portable. Forklifts rusted mid-aisle. Shipping manifests fluttered on clipboards that no longer matched reality. I found a body near a loading dock. Not fresh, not staged, just someone who had sat down and not gotten back up. No signs of violence. No theft. Their shoes were still on. I did not check for identification. I continued walking. At night, I slept in places that did not feel chosen. A stairwell, a bus shelter, once inside a store where mannequins had been arranged facing the entrance, as if to watch for customers who would never return. I did not speak aloud for 2 days. When I finally did, my voice sounded unfamiliar, thinner, less certain. Outside the city core, infrastructure decayed faster. Power lines down without repair. Substations vandalized or stripped. Water towers marked with warnings that no one enforced. I followed roads until roads stopped meaning anything. Cars sat where they had died. Some with doors open, some still locked. One had a map taped to the dashboard with a route highlighted in red. The route ended at a place that no longer existed as a destination. Highways were worse. The traffic was gone, but the aftermath remained. Burned out vehicles. Piles of belongings abandoned where people realized carrying them slowed escape. Shoes, blankets, toys. I did not count the bodies. I reached a rest area on the third week after leaving the station. The bathrooms had been converted into living space by a group of 6 people who eyed me carefully but did not threaten me. They asked where I was going. I told them I didn't know. They accepted that answer. We shared food without discussing fairness. That alone told me they would not last long. Kindness without structure burns itself out quickly. They asked if I knew what happened. I told them what I had seen. They listened like people listening to weather reports. Not hoping for change, just needing context for suffering. In the morning, I left before they woke up. Cities farther out looked different. Not better, just less processed. Fewer barricades, fewer rules, more emptiness. Buildings intact but unused. Stores untouched because no one needed what was inside anymore. I scavenged what I could. Water from questionable sources. Food past dates that no longer mattered. I stopped getting sick after a while, or maybe I stopped noticing. Death became ordinary, not frightening, not tragic, just present. A fact of terrain. I passed through a neighborhood where every house had the same symbol painted on the door. A warning, or a claim, or both. I did not ask. People watched me pass and let me go. By the time winter arrived, I had stopped thinking of myself as a broadcaster. I was just a person who remembered too much. Rumors don't spread the way news used to. They move sideways now, person to person, camp to camp, changed slightly each time, like a phrase passed along by people who don't fully trust their own memory. The first time I heard it, it was spoken quietly, like a superstition that might punish belief. They said the authorities didn't disappear. They went down. Not shelters for civilians. Not continuity bunkers like the old brochures promised. Purpose-built spaces sealed long before the collapse became public. Power, water, years of planning hidden behind budget lines no one ever read closely. I didn't react when I heard it. I'd learned that reacting gave rumors weight they didn't deserve. The second time I heard it, the details matched too closely to ignore. A man at a roadside fire said his sister worked facilities maintenance at a research complex before everything fell apart. He said her last message mentioned a transfer list. Names already approved. Access already granted. She wasn't on it. The third time, I heard it from someone who had no reason to invent it. An old logistics officer, retired long before the collapse. He said the withdrawals made sense in hindsight. The timing, the routes, the silence afterward. He said you don't abandon command unless command has already relocated. I asked him where. He said he didn't know. He said knowing wasn't required for belief. I carried that rumor for weeks without repeating it. Not because it frightened me, because it fit too well. I began noticing signs that supported it without proving anything. Military-grade infrastructure left untouched while civilian systems decayed. Satellite debris that still moved in predictable patterns. Weather forecasts that no one officially released but occasionally appeared, incomplete on forgotten frequencies. Someone was still watching. Not enough to help. Enough to observe. That distinction mattered. I found an old emergency radio in a farmhouse that had been cleared out carefully, not looted. I repaired it with parts scavenged from places that no longer had owners. Took longer than it should have. My hands weren't steady anymore. When it finally powered on, it didn't bring voices. It brought structure. Encrypted bursts at regular intervals. Not messages meant for me. Not broadcasts meant to reassure. Just coordination signals exchanged between systems that assumed the world above no longer required inclusion. I listened anyway. The signals never changed. That told me more than content ever could. Years blurred after that. I stopped tracking days when calendars became jokes. Seasons still happened, but they felt less personal. Summer burned. Winter took. Spring pretended nothing had changed. I moved when places became too organized or too desperate. The middle ground was safest. Communities that remembered cooperation but hadn't yet formalized control. I stayed nowhere long. People asked fewer questions as time passed. Not because they trusted me, because curiosity wastes energy. Food became simpler. Water became whatever didn't kill you immediately. I learned how to tell the difference most of the time. I learned which sicknesses passed and which didn't. I learned that grief has a shelf life. After a while, it stops being sharp and becomes structural. Something you build around. I found cities half buried in vines and dust. Towers with windows blown out by storms no one repaired. Streets reclaimed by plants that didn't care about zoning laws. Inside one such city, I found a working broadcast tower. Not powerful, not wide-reaching, but intact. I stood at its base for a long time before climbing. Not afraid of falling. Afraid of hearing myself again. At the top, the equipment was old but functional. Analog, durable, designed for people who expected failure. I didn't turn it on. Not yet. I wasn't sure what there was left to say. The world no longer needed warnings. It needed memory, and memory is heavier to carry than fear. I left the tower untouched and moved on. That choice followed me longer than I expected. I passed through a valley where people had dammed a river with scrap and patience. They grew crops in careful rows and buried their dead with names carved into stone. They asked me to stay. I didn't. Staying meant becoming part of something that would eventually have to decide who belonged. I had learned what that became. Further south, I encountered a group that wore uniforms again. Not official ones. Replicas. They enforced rules that sounded like laws but had no appeal process. They claimed to protect infrastructure that no longer mattered. I avoided them. One night, during a storm that came without warning, I took shelter in an underground service tunnel. There, etched into the wall, were words written by someone who had been hiding longer than me. They left US on purpose. No date, no signature, just certainty. I slept poorly after that. Not because I was afraid it was true, because I was afraid it wasn't. If it was true, then the collapse was a decision. If it wasn't, then it was negligence so complete it might as well have been. I don't know which version of that is worse. Time continued. Hair went gray. Teeth loosened. Muscles forgot what abundance felt like. I adapted. Not well. Just enough. Eventually, I began to speak aloud again, even when no one was there, describing what I saw, marking changes, recording loss without an audience. The habit returned on its own. That was when I knew I would transmit again. Not to save anyone, not to warn, just to leave a record that said someone stayed awake long enough to notice. I returned to the tower in late autumn. I knew it by the way the air changed before I saw it. Less wind, more echo. The city around it had settled into a shape that didn't pretend to be alive anymore. No smoke columns, no movement that suggested routine, just structures holding their breath. The climb took longer than it should have. My knees complained now in ways they never used to. I stopped twice, not from fear of falling, but from remembering how easily I once trusted my body to obey. At the top, the door still held. Inside, dust coated the equipment evenly. No signs of tampering, no scavenger marks. That alone told me most people no longer believed in voices from the air. Too many lies had come that way. Too many promises had traveled on clean frequencies. I wiped the main console with my sleeve and checked the connections. Power was available from a small turbine rigged sometime after the collapse. Someone had cared enough to keep it alive, then left without taking credit. I tested the microphone. My voice sounded older, not weaker, just stripped. Years of speaking only when necessary had sanded off everything decorative. What remained was factual, efficient. I did not introduce myself. Names matter less when there is no one left to repeat them. I began by describing where I was, what I could see from the tower, how the city looked now. Not ruined, just concluded. Buildings still stood, but they no longer expected use. Roads curved without purpose. Nature had not reclaimed everything. It had only taken what wasn't defended. I spoke for 15 minutes and stopped. The silence afterward felt different than before. Not empty, expectant. I waited. A response came an hour later. Not a voice, a signal acknowledgement. Someone somewhere had received the transmission and let the system confirm it. That was enough. I began broadcasting every third day. Not schedules. Schedules imply obligation. I spoke when I had something to record, when I had moved through a place long enough to understand its shape. People began to respond slowly. A man from the coast said he listened from a lighthouse where the automated beacon still turned. A woman inland said she recorded the transmissions onto tape because digital storage no longer lasted. A group in the mountains said they gathered to listen, not because they expected guidance, but because hearing continuity helped them sleep. I did not offer guidance. I told them what I had seen, what no longer existed, what patterns repeated even after everything else changed. I told them about the councils that became prisons, about the kindness that burned out, about the rumor of those who went underground and never returned. I made it clear that I did not know if that rumor was true. I said ignorance out loud. Felt important. One night, someone asked why I bothered. The question came without accusation, just curiosity. I answered honestly. I said that collapse doesn't end when buildings fall or systems fail. It ends when no one remembers what was lost or how it happened. I said that forgetting was the final luxury of a civilization, and we had already spent it once. After that, the questions stopped. Time resumed its uneven flow. I grew thinner, slower, more deliberate. I marked years by changes in my voice rather than dates. I knew I was aging because I could hear it. I described the winters that came earlier and stayed longer, the summers that burned crops without mercy, the animals that adapted faster than we did. I described a town that sealed itself entirely and vanished behind its walls. No smoke, no sound. When I returned months later, the gates were still closed. I did not knock. I described a river that ran clear again after decades of poison, and the people who drank from it without ceremony because celebration wastes energy. I described finding a schoolbook half buried in dirt, its lessons no longer applicable but its handwriting still careful. Listeners dwindled, not abruptly, gradually. Voices dropped off. Signals ceased. Places I spoke to went silent and did not return. I did not speculate why. Eventually, there were only a few, then fewer, until one night, after a long gap, no acknowledgement came. I spoke again the next cycle. Nothing. I checked the equipment. It functioned perfectly. Power stable. Frequency clear. There was simply no one left listening. I continued anyway, not out of hope, out of habit, out of refusal to let the world end without a witness. The last thing I recorded was not dramatic. I described the sound of wind moving through broken windows, the way shadows fell differently now that no one trimmed trees, the feeling of speaking into a space that did not answer. I realized then that this had never been a broadcast. It was a confession, a record of choices made and not made, of moments where silence felt safer than action, of a world that didn't end because of monsters or miracles, but because too many systems assumed someone else would take responsibility. I ended the transmission without saying goodbye. There was no one left who needed it. That distinction mattered. Expectation carries disappointment with it. Without it, the act became lighter, almost mechanical. Wake, check power, speak, record, sleep. Days were no longer units of meaning. They were containers, some empty, some heavier than others. I stopped referring to the audience altogether, not because I believed there was none, but because imagining one felt dishonest. If someone heard me, they would hear me as I was, not as a voice trying to reach them. I spoke about small things, A bridge that finally collapsed under its own rust, not traffic. A grocery sign still lit by a stubborn solar panel, advertising prices that now felt fictional. A field where grass grew in perfect rows, evidence of farming that continued without anyone naming it. The world did not look apocalyptic anymore. That surprised me. It looked resolved, not healed, just finished arguing with itself. I realized one evening that I no longer remembered the last time I had seen a large group of people together. Even the organized ones had thinned. Control requires energy, and energy runs out faster than hope. I traveled less, not because it was dangerous, but because novelty stopped offering reward. Every place eventually told the same story if you stayed long enough. I stayed near the tower because it still functioned, and because leaving it again felt unnecessary. The city below had become a map of memory rather than a destination. One winter, the turbine froze solid. I waited 3 days before attempting repairs, rationing power and speech. Silence crept back in, but this time it felt earned rather than imposed. When the turbine turned again, I did not feel relief, just continuation. My voice changed further, cracked sometimes, not emotionally, physically. I rested more between transmissions. I shortened sentences. Precision mattered more than rhythm now. I began repeating myself, not because I forgot what I had said before, but because repetition was honest. The world was repeating itself too. Seasons, mistakes, small kindnesses that failed quietly. If someone discovered these recordings later, I wanted them to understand that the end was not a single event. It was maintenance that stopped happening. I spoke about that often, about how systems don't need villains to fail, just indifference stretched over time. Deferred responsibility passed like a burden no one wanted to carry. I admitted my own part in that, not as a confession seeking forgiveness, just acknowledgement. I stayed at the microphone when someone needed water. I chose documentation over intervention. I told myself it mattered more. I don't know if it did. That uncertainty never resolved. One night, I heard another transmission overlapping mine. Not words, breathing. Someone else speaking into an open line without realizing it was live. The sound lasted less than a minute and cut off abruptly. I did not respond. If they wanted contact, they would try again. They never did. Spring came early the following year. Plants pushed through concrete that had resisted them for decades. Birds nested in places where no one chased them away anymore. The city smelled cleaner than it ever had when it was alive. I described that without irony. The absence of us improved some things. That was uncomfortable to say out loud, but lying about it would have been worse. I began to feel tired in a way sleep did not fix. Not exhausted, complete, like a task nearing its natural conclusion. I reduced transmissions to once a week, then once a month. Each time felt like a negotiation with something inside me that had not yet accepted finality. I wondered who would notice when I stopped. The answer, I suspected, was no one. That thought did not frighten me. Clarified things. I recorded one transmission describing the tower itself. Its construction, its age, its flaws, how long it might stand without maintenance, where the access points were, what tools remained nearby. I did not say why. I spoke another describing the city below in exact detail, so precise it bordered on obsessive. Streets, landmarks, distances, not for navigation, for proof that these places existed, that they mattered enough to be named. I listened to the recording afterward and realized I was speaking the way archivists do. Not broadcasters, not witnesses, curators of absence. I slept longer after that. Dreams came less often. When they did, they were quiet. I did not dream of water anymore. That question arrived late, long after they had stopped changing outcomes. When everything was still functioning, words were tools, instructions, persuasion, warnings, apologies. You said them because you expected movement on the other end. Now they were artifacts. I noticed that when I spoke, I chose words more carefully than I ever had before. Not for clarity, for endurance. I avoided slang, avoided references that assumed shared experience. I stripped sentences down until they could stand on their own without context. I was no longer speaking to people who lived when I did. I was speaking to time. That realization altered how I described things. I stopped assuming knowledge. I stopped saying "as you know" or "as before." I treated every transmission as if it might be the first and only one someone ever found. I explained what a grocery store used to be, what a commute meant, why traffic lights existed, why people trusted water to come out of walls without question. I explained what I failed to question. The tower creaked more now when the wind changed direction. Not dangerously, just enough to remind me that nothing stays neutral forever. Maintenance is a promise you make daily, and I had not kept it. I considered climbing down and leaving again, letting the tower stand unused like everything else. But leaving felt like abandoning the final thread that connected before to after. So I stayed. I spoke about the first weeks again, but differently. Less chronology, more cause. I admitted how easily vague statements calmed me at first, how much authority I granted to language alone, how reassurance delayed action long enough for delay to become fatal. I spoke about the man who asked for water. I did not justify myself this time. I said his name finally. I had learned it later from a list I found in a shelter that no longer sheltered anyone. Saying it out loud felt heavier than any accusation. I said I did not know what happened to his wife. I said that uncertainty had followed me longer than hunger. After that transmission, I did not speak for weeks. Not because I had nothing to say, because I needed to hear silence again, without trying to fill it. When I returned to the microphone, my voice startled me. It sounded smaller, like it had been resting somewhere it didn't quite fit anymore. I described aging, not abstractly, practically. Slower reflexes, joints that protested cold, eyes that struggled with low light, teeth that required attention I could no longer easily give. I wanted the record to show that survival was not a victory state. It was a process of narrowing tolerances. I also described what did not change. The instinct to look for other people, even when logic said they were unlikely to be there. The reflex to listen for footsteps. The way loneliness didn't arrive as pain, but as a flattening of emotion. I realized one evening that I could no longer remember the sound of a crowd. Not distinctly, not as a composite of voices, just a vague impression of noise without shape. That bothered me more than forgetting faces. I spoke about that too. I described how memory decays not evenly, but selectively. How strong emotions preserve some things and erase others. How the collapse itself had become less vivid than the weeks before it. Disaster is sharp. Aftermath is dull. I wondered if that was why so many civilizations forgot their endings. Not because they chose to, but because endurance blunted the edge. I did not want that to happen here. So I repeated myself deliberately. I restated causes. I restated sequences. I restated responsibility. Not assigning blame to individuals, but to habits, to assumptions, to systems that rewarded delay and punished alarm. I said that often. Punished alarm. I wondered how many people turned away from early warnings because they sounded inconvenient instead of catastrophic. I wondered how many times I had done the same. The equipment began failing in minor ways. A dial that stuck. A connection that required reseating. Nothing fatal. Just reminders that I was operating borrowed time. I recorded a transmission explaining how to operate the console, how to tune the frequency, how to power the system if someone came after me and wanted to use it. I did not assume they would, but assuming absence felt arrogant too. I stopped counting how long I had been alone. Numbers stopped offering insight. What mattered was that I was still here, and the voice still worked, and the record continued. That was enough. For now. There came a point when I stopped checking for responses entirely. Not consciously. I just realized one day that I no longer paused after speaking. I didn't wait for acknowledgments, signal returns, or the faint suggestion that someone else might still be timing their life around my words. I spoke, ended the transmission, and moved on to the next task without ceremony. That was how I knew the broadcast had changed again. It wasn't communication anymore. It was preservation. I began organizing my notes with more care than before. Not chronologically. The order no longer mattered. I grouped observations instead. Infrastructure, health, social behavior, language drift. Each category filled with fragments that would never form a complete picture on their own, but together suggested a shape. I wondered who might find them. I wondered if they would matter. The city continued to age. Buildings didn't collapse dramatically. They softened. Corners rounded. Paint peeled into patterns that no longer suggested neglect, just time. Metal fixtures loosened. Glass clouded. The environment didn't rage against absence. It accommodated it. I describe this shift often because it contradicted the stories people used to tell about endings. There was no constant fire, no endless noise, just gradual quiet settling into something like acceptance. I noticed animals had adjusted their routes, paths worn into places humans once avoided. A family of deer crossed a downtown street at dusk without urgency. Birds nested inside traffic lights. I described that too, careful not to romanticize it. This was not recovery. It was reallocation. One afternoon, while scavenging for spare parts, I found a box of old audio tapes in a basement that smelled of mildew and paper. Personal recordings. Messages never sent. Someone practicing a speech they never gave. Someone recording a child's voice reading aloud. I listened to one tape all the way through. Then I rewound it and put it back. Some things didn't need to be added to the record. They already existed fully. My health declined slowly enough to feel hypothetical. Weight loss I could explain away. Fatigue I attributed to age. A persistent cough that came and went. I recorded none of that at first. Illness felt too personal, and I had trained myself to stay impersonal for years. But eventually, I understood that excluding myself from the record was another kind of distortion. So I mentioned it, briefly, without emphasis. I said that bodies fail even when systems already have. That survival does not mean stability. That there is no plateau where everything becomes manageable again. Listeners, if any remained, did not respond. I didn't expect them to. Winter returned harder than the one before it. The turbine iced twice. I adapted the schedule again. Shorter transmissions. Longer gaps. I conserved strength the way I once conserved fuel. I spoke about cold. Not just temperature, but what it does to decision-making. How discomfort narrows options. How endurance becomes a calculation instead of a feeling. I spoke about how many decisions near the end are made simply because they require the least movement. I wondered aloud whether that applied to civilizations too. During one long silence between transmissions, I realized I had not spoken to another person in months. That realization arrived without panic. Just recognition. I tested my voice by reading aloud from one of the notebooks. It sounded distant to me, like hearing a recording from a different room. I wondered if that was how I always sounded to others, or if the change was mine alone. The distinction felt unimportant. I climbed down from the tower less often. Stairs took effort now. Each descent required justification. Each ascent required planning. I began sleeping in the broadcast room instead of returning to my shelter nearby. It saved steps, kept everything in one place. Efficiency replaced preference. I rearranged the equipment so that I could reach everything without standing. I made these changes methodically, the way people do when they know they are optimizing for decline rather than growth. I documented that too. Not the changes themselves, but the mindset behind them. I said that collapse teaches you how to live smaller, how to reduce needs without reducing awareness, how to accept limits without mistaking them for peace. One evening, while preparing to transmit, I realized I was out of one of the medications I had been stretching for months. I noted it aloud, not as a complaint, as a data point. I did not attempt to replace it. Scavenging had become riskier than the benefit justified. I accepted that calculation with surprising ease. After the transmission ended, I sat in silence longer than usual. I listened to the wind move through the tower structure. The low vibration traveling through metal and bone alike felt less like sound and more like pressure. I thought about the beginning again. Not the disaster. The normal days before it. The way routine dulled attention. The way warnings blended into background noise. The way I trusted systems because distrusting them required effort. I said all of that out loud, slowly, carefully, as if dictating something that would be studied rather than heard. I ended that transmission with a sentence I did not plan beforehand. I said that the world did not end when we lost power or water or governance. It ended when we stopped expecting responsibility to be personal. I did not repeat that sentence again. Some things only need to be said once. The medication wore off gradually. Not in the way people imagine, with sudden pain or collapse. It faded like background noise you don't realize you've been relying on until it's gone. The cough returned first, deeper now, less negotiable. Then the fatigue stopped lifting after rest. Then the mornings stopped feeling like beginnings. I recorded those changes only once. After that, I decided not to track them anymore. Measurement creates expectation, and expectation implies an outcome. I no longer needed either. I adjusted the broadcast again. Short statements, fewer metaphors. I stopped trying to make anything sound meaningful. Meaning survives without decoration, if it survives at all. I began each transmission the same way, not with a greeting, but with context. Date approximations, location, weather conditions. I said them as if filling out a form, because that's what it was. A record of conditions at the end of a long process. Sometimes I read from older notebooks and corrected myself. Not because the original observations were wrong, but because perspective had changed. Early certainty looked naive now. Late restraint looked like honesty. I made sure to say that out loud. If someone listened to everything in sequence, I wanted them to hear the shift. To understand that the voice they were hearing did not start where it ended. One afternoon, while scavenging near the base of the tower, I found a body I recognized. Not the face, the posture. A person who had been listening. I knew because I had once described the tower in detail on air, and they had arrived weeks later with a notebook containing my words, copied carefully, as if transcription itself were an act of faith. They were older than I remembered. Or maybe they had always been that way, and I had only heard them through the filter of transmission. They had not died violently. They had come, waited, and not left. I did not speak about that on air for a long time. When I finally did, I did not describe the body. I described the notebook, the handwriting, the corrections in the margins, the effort it takes to preserve something when you believe it matters. I said that belief does not guarantee survival. I said it guarantees intention. After that, the tower felt fuller and emptier at the same time. I rearranged my sleeping space so I could see the city through a broken window while lying down. At night, distant fires still appeared occasionally. Not large ones, cooking fires, signal fires, accidents. They flared and died without pattern. I stopped wondering who they belonged to. Wondering had become an inefficient use of energy. I reduced transmissions to one sentence some days. Simple observations. The river level dropped again. No movement in the Western District. Snow arrived earlier this year. I imagined someone finding these fragments later, not knowing which mattered more. I decided that wasn't my problem to solve. I slept more. Not deeply, not restfully, but often. Waking became a negotiation. Each morning required a reason. Some days, the reason was simply that I had not finished speaking yet. I noticed my hands shaking when I adjusted the controls. The movement still worked, just slower, deliberate. I explained that on air too. I said that decline is not a moment. It is a series of small accommodations you make until one day you realize you are living entirely inside them. I said that civilizations do the same thing. They adapt to less until less feels normal. I did not accuse anyone. I did not absolve anyone. Blame had lost its usefulness long ago. One evening, while preparing to transmit, I realized I could no longer hear the faint hum of the equipment the way I used to. Either it had grown quieter or my hearing had changed. I tapped the casing lightly to confirm it was still operating. It was. That uncertainty stayed with me. I wondered how much of the world I was no longer perceiving accurately, and how long that had been true. I decided not to worry about it. Accuracy had always been aspirational. I spoke one final long transmission near the end of winter. I summarized everything without summarizing anything. I spoke about how collapse was never a single failure, but an accumulation of tolerated inefficiencies. How warnings that arrive too early are ignored, and warnings that arrive too late are useless. How responsibility diffused across systems until it dissolved completely. I said that what happened here could happen anywhere. Not because people are evil, because they are busy. I paused often during that transmission. Not for effect, for breath. When I finished, I did not shut the system down. I left it as it was. The next few days blurred. I did not transmit. Not because I decided to stop, because I did not feel the need to speak. Silence had become complete enough to hold its own meaning. When I did return to the microphone, I did not sit. I leaned against the console, steadied by muscle memory rather than strength. I said only this, that I stayed to the end because someone had to know what the end looked like from the inside. That it was not fire. That it was not darkness. That it was not chaos. It was quiet systems failing politely, one after another, until there was nothing left that required a response. That detail matters only because I didn't remember lying down. The light coming through the broken window told me it was morning, though I no longer tracked which morning it was. The cold had eased slightly. Early thaw, maybe, or just a good day pretending to be one. I stayed where I was for a long time, listening. Not for signals. For myself. Breathing still happened without instruction. That felt worth noting. The cough came after, as expected, deep enough to require patience. When it passed, I rolled onto my side and waited for the room to stop shifting. There was no urgency. Urgency had left the world before I did. When I stood, it was slowly, with both hands on the console. The equipment felt familiar under my fingers. Not comforting, just known. I could have adjusted the dials with my eyes closed. Muscle memory outlasts conviction. I considered not transmitting again. Not because I was tired, because the record already felt complete. Everything essential had been said, if not heard. Another transmission would not change the shape of the story. It would only extend the line a little farther into silence. That thought stayed with me while I prepared. I drank the last of the water I had set aside for this purpose. Not the last water I owned. The last water I intended to drink here. I left the rest untouched. Someone else might need it, or no one would. Either outcome was acceptable. I sat. The chair felt larger than it used to, or maybe I had become smaller. I adjusted the microphone, then paused, my hand resting there longer than necessary. I realized I had not said my name since the beginning. That wasn't intentional. It just hadn't been useful. I did not say it now. I began by stating what this was. I said that this was not a warning, not a request, not a call for help. I said it was a conclusion. I spoke slowly, not for emphasis, but because speed no longer served clarity. Each sentence felt like it had to justify its existence. I described the tower one last time. Its height, its age, the way the metal vibrated faintly in the wind, a sound that had become a companion rather than a threat. I described the city below in fewer words than ever before, because there was nothing left to inventory. I said that I had stayed because leaving early would have meant guessing how it ended. I said I stayed because guessing felt like a kind of lie. I admitted that I had once believed documentation was a form of responsibility, that if someone recorded events carefully enough, truth would carry its own weight. I said I no longer believed that. Truth does not move on its own. It requires people willing to act on it while action is still possible. I said that quietly. I spoke about how the collapse never required a single bad decision. It required thousands of reasonable ones made in isolation. Each deferral justified. Each compromise explained. Each warning softened so it would be easier to accept. I said that no one wakes up intending to let everything fail. They wake up intending to get through the day. I spoke about myself again, briefly. I said that I had been useful once, and that usefulness had kept me alive longer than most. That was not virtue. It was circumstance. I said that if I had been braver earlier, I might have mattered more later. I did not dwell on that. Dwelling is indulgence. I acknowledged the possibility that someone might hear this far in the future, that they might find the recordings intact and search them for lessons. I said that if that happened, they should not look for villains. They should look for habits. They should look for the places where responsibility became abstract and therefore optional. I paused there longer than before. Breathing had become work now, but manageable work. Like everything else near the end, it was a calculation rather than a sensation. I continued. I said that the world did not deserve what happened to it. Not because it was innocent, but because no world does. I said that endings do not need to be deserved to arrive. I said that if anything survived us, it would not be because we planned for it, but because life is stubborn in ways we are not. I did not call that hope. I called it observation. I felt the tremor in my hands again and allowed it. Fighting it required energy I no longer needed to spend. I adjusted my posture so the microphone would not pick it up too clearly. I was aware then that this would be the last time I spoke like this. Not dramatically, factually. I said that this record existed because I was afraid of silence at first, and then because I learned to respect it. That the broadcasts continued not to fill the void, but to outline it. I said that the end of civilization did not sound like screaming. It sounded like unanswered messages piling up in systems no one maintained anymore. I said that if someone found this, and they were wondering when exactly the world ended, the answer was not a date. It was a threshold. The moment when enough people decided that responsibility belonged to someone else. I stopped there, not because I had run out of things to say, because adding more would have diluted what mattered. I reached forward and shut down the transmitter deliberately, not because it failed, because I was finished. The silence that followed did not feel heavy, felt correct. I remained seated for a while, longer than necessary, then stood and moved to the window. The city looked the same as it had the day before and the day before that. No sign marked this moment as different. That felt appropriate too. I lay down where the light was warmest and closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to rest without intention. Breathing slowed, thoughts thinned. The weight I had been carrying for years loosened without ceremony. The record was complete. Nothing else required a witness.